Ajit Mishra.
Hi,
We welcome you. Professor Dr. Ajit Mishra is the current director of the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi, India. He has been actively engaged in research and lecturing over the last 25 years in several areas of economics, economic development, public economics, and economic theory. Prior to joining the institute, he taught at the University of Bath, and besides, he has taught at various other institutions, including the University of Dundee, Scottish Graduate Programme, University of Edinburgh, Delhi School of Economics, Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, and Ashoka University. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. So can I start sharing my screen now?
Yes, sure, sir.
Okay, let me just... Yeah, I think it's working.
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Okay, good. Thank you, Mansi, and thank you, Prashant, and thank you, Dr. Nagar. Thank you, Hitesh, everybody, the organizers, for giving me a chance. And also, I must say, I would say congratulations to the organizers. It's a fabulous program, not because I'm part of it, but everybody else. It's superb, and I didn't know that Professor Kaushik Basu was going to talk about his Republic of Beliefs yesterday. I would have, so that's why I've changed. Even though the title has beliefs, I'm going to go quiet on that, because after you have listened to it. Okay, so I'm just going to reflect some of my thoughts in this area. First one is a little, it's tangential, but I think it sets the stage in some sense. Okay, so here are some numbers. According to the World Justice Project, if we look at a sample of 128 countries, and the rule of law index, okay, varies from the highest being 0.9, so that's Denmark, which gets the first rank, to 0.27, so that's Venezuela. Okay, and in between there are obviously countries. So natural curiosity will be, where does India lie? Well, it is fairly right in the middle. It's 0.51, the index, and rank is 69. Okay, the scale is 0 to 1. So we're somewhere in the middle. Now, obviously, some of us probably would not believe in these indices. There are so many of them these days, from corruption perception index to innovation index and so on and so forth. But still, I take two observations from this. So what I'm calling takeaways. Now, again, you probably will have different ones. The first one that strikes me is the divergence. Okay, it's in fact in many of these, even in CPI, the corruption perception index, I find the divergence very, very surprising. Okay, these are subjective, so in the sense these are based on questionnaires and things like this. So it's likely to have that, but still it's quite a bit. Okay? So for example, the top one is nearly 3 times, so that's 300% divergence. Surely it can't be that these systems have different sets of laws. We know that the rule of law index is not just a reflection of how effective the law is. It's also about the general governance. It's about control of corruption. It's about constraints on executives and so on and so forth. But still, there is more to having a set of laws, that the different societies are placed so far apart. And the second thing that strikes me from this, it's independent of this data, is that I've noticed over the last few years that we have a tendency to rush towards legal solutions. Okay, though our record is somewhere in the middle, I'm being very generous here. So in the sense, some people might say our record is not at all spectacular, despite the level of judicial activism that we see. Effectiveness is probably not so great. But still, we tend to push towards legal solutions. In fact, I'll just take half a minute digression. So even if we have a political problem, people will, you will see rush to the court, okay, to find a solution to this. Even if we have other conflicts, religious conflict and things like this, we tend to rely on that. And even then, we find a loophole somewhere in behavior in the corporate world. We want to plug it with some new rules and some acts and things. So there is a tendency to do that, which may be fine, but in some sense, we need to look at whether there is an implicit assumption that the implementation of the desired outcome through legal intervention is straightforward. Okay. Now, my answer will be, and in fact, the discussions after this 30 minutes, and I hope to convince you that it's not so straightforward. Okay? You probably have already been exposed to Prof. Basu's emphasis on the hierarchy and the Republic of Beliefs, that laws are essentially a focal point. So it depends on the overall game context, and they themselves are not going to try to form any desired outcome. Okay, so that's a rough way of introduction. And so let me get a bit more specific. Okay. Now, so what do they do, these laws? Okay, so this is where I'm kind of a novice. You people know more about the foundations of law than I do. But so I'm just taking what various law and economic scholars have put. Legal scholars will probably go more deeper, go more fundamental. So the way I see it, law essentially influences social outcomes or socioeconomic outcomes through one or more of the following. So you can see the game theory training is coming here. They change the payoffs associated with actions. Okay, so that's it could be any interaction can be modeled as a game. So we are saying that they are going to change the payoffs. It could be that need not be equilibrium payoffs. Okay, so it could be changes in the reservation or disagreement payoffs. Okay, so supposing we are negotiating a contract or negotiating some arrangement, and if we fail, what happens? Well, in the disagreement, what are our rights? What are our obligations? What we are entitled to, and all those kind of things. They essentially determine our disagreement payoff. Okay, and we may not always use it. So they're not part of our final outcome or equilibrium, but they affect what happens to the outcome. Or it could be more stronger that it changes in the rules of the game. So how we interact. So that itself can change. Okay. So what's the bottom line? Why am I doing all this? Well, this suggests that they are like any other intervention aimed at shaping incentives and behavior. Supposing I'm doing a first year or second year micro, that's what I say. What's the role of incentives? Well, incentives are meant to blah, 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 all these things. Okay, they're supposed to change the payoff. They're supposed to change your reservation utility, your disagreement payoff, and things like this. Okay, maybe not the last, but they're very similar. So it's a very typical economist way of looking at the legal world. It's almost like taking it as a system of elaborate incentives. Okay? Or at least that's the way it can affect. So here is my example. I worked on corruption, as some of you might know. So my first example is control of corruption. Okay, to see what I mean by illegal solution. So here is the background. An official can grant a permit, so that I'm calling A for action, because here the action is to give the permit to this firm, which, by the way, is not such a desirable thing, because the firm, its private benefit X is lower than the social cost. So you could be in a polluting firm, or it could be a firm which is going to sell dangerous goods, or whatever. So essentially, it's something which is not ideal. Okay, so that's the source. Now, a typical decision maker, the official will compare the cost and benefit of her action. Okay, so that I'm using as I'm using U in a different ways everywhere, but that's just my laziness, not writing utility, but putting a functional form. Okay, so the utility from this action, that is giving the permit to this firm, is some gain, so which I'm calling f of x. And why is it dependent on x? Because in some sense, I must be getting something from the other person's benefit or for the firm's benefit. Okay, minus a small term alpha times h. So I'm allowing for these officials to be kind of, social minded. Okay, that's what they were in that particular job precisely for that reason. So they will gain, some negative utility if they permit the firm to go ahead. Okay, so that's a fairly general utility function. We can incorporate to many things. So the first implication that even if when alpha is very small, official will not choose to permit unless there are gains to her. Okay, so which is why we need that. So this could be bribes by the firm or other private benefits. It could be a, thinking that I'm related to a politician who happens to be from that particular district, so I want some benefits for my local constituents, employment, stuff like this. So these are in some sense what I'm calling private benefits. Or it could be, there need not be a transaction of monetary transfer. It could be non-monetary benefit. The person could be from my caste, my clan, my distant relative, all sorts of things. So we'll combine all those things. And if it's bribery, we can look at the net benefit from bribery and compare whether that's exceeds the cost or not. Okay. So why have I set it up elaborately instead of just putting it saying that well, because I want to convince you that the solution space is very large. So here are some examples. So one could be, you could say moral environmental education. Okay, so make it the alpha high. Or I could internalize the social cost by making the official or the decision maker interested in the final outcome. Okay. So think of a case where we make, the decision maker, we privatize, let's say, in some sense, or we kind of delegate completely, and the incentives to the decision maker is now the level of edge. Okay, so if you're thinking of these are, let's say, chemical farms, and we are worried about pollutants in the river, so we make the compensation based on the level of pollutant in the river. Okay, so that's like what I'm calling internalizing the social cost to some extent for the decision maker. So that's also possible. Or so even if it's being bribed, the bribes will get outweighed by this cost. Or we could say we could target bribery itself. And we can say we reduce the net benefit from bribery. Okay, so there again, I can think of schemes. Let's say, so I'm going to reward successful rejection. So supposing you are the decision maker and you tell me, you come up to me, I'm the regulator of the planner, come up to me that these are 5 applications you have raised. Upon scrutiny, you realize that their social costs were very high, and you have rejected them. Okay? So I'm going to reward you based on this, let's say. So that will make you more biased in favor of that. Or I could make pollution less desirable by reducing the net benefit of X. Okay, but that's the total that the firm is willing to pay to get this permit. So I could reduce X in various ways. Okay, further supervision, cancellation of license if caught, and stuff like this. Or we know I could encourage peer pressures and social sanctions against bribery. I mean, think of a university where, let's say, one of our colleagues can take a bribe to release question papers. Okay. Now, you don't need a sanction for against this. Nobody will do it because if somebody does it, the amount of social sanction or even localized peer sanction will be so much that it's unthinkable. Okay? So that's you don't need anything. And the last one, make bribery illegal, which is what we normally do. So that's many of the textbooks on corruption will call it the legal solution. Okay, so in some sense we try to control bribery because we think that the solution to the original problem is in fact to solve bribery, and we bring in there is a sanction is F, and to implement the sanction we do need some enforcement effort. So we'll have an inspector who will go and inspect, or tax inspector is going to check your tax records and things like this. So that's going to determine Q. So Q is, as you would know, it's the probability of apprehension or detection, and F is the sanction. And in fact, let's now just forget about you being bothered about the social cost. So alpha is 0. So we're going to need B minus QF to be less than or equal to 0. So whatever be the bribe, I must adjust the enforcement effort and sanction in such a way that it doesn't pay. Okay. So that's the classic deterrence problem that we always start with. Okay. And there are obviously a lot of variations. As I said, you probably would have, Kosik probably would have used something similar to talk about how we have this tips, because the sanctions are essentially a part of your billing that it's going to happen. Or I could also talk about app may be replaced by expected sanctions. So that is, it's not the real sanction, but the fact that if you get caught, you have to pay a bribe to the your superior, and so on and so forth. Okay, so all those things we know we can do. More recently, as some of you know, there have been calls to include behavioral features also. Okay? So belief about Q. Q is not an objective figure posted on some government website. Okay, my beliefs about Q, what I think the Q do. It could be that overconfidence we know is quite common. So those who commit the crime, those who take the bribe will probably be exhibiting overconfidence in the sense that they think they're less likely to be caught. We could also bring in inconsistent discounting. So that's what I mean is hyperbolic discounting. So in the sense you probably discount the benefits at a lower rate than the cost. Okay? And we could think of framing and so on and so forth. Okay? So in fact, there's a nice survey by McAdams and Rulon on the behavioral economics and criminal law. So we can, enrich. So what I'm going to do here in the next 10 minutes is consider another aspect and look at some of the implications. My concern is always with those who comply and those who do not. Okay, so it's not that I'm just looking at what's the level of deterrence, but I'm also looking at what happens to the people who comply, so who are deterred, and what happens to those who did not. For the last couple of years, we have been working with Andrew Samuel, my co-author, on that the decision to follow law is not always a simple choice. Agents are conflicted between different sets of values. It could be group loyalty versus fairness. It could be nepotism. It could be conflicting commitments of various kinds. I'm going to quickly go over it and then just introduce one such conflicting. So that's based on the Gould-Pessendorfer work. Some of you again might have heard about it or have seen it. It's that agents have, or decision makers have, two types of preference. One is a commitment preference, so which is the normal thing that we use for rational economic users, and the other one is temptation preference. Okay, so here is my example. So supposing I have this commitment preference where I think the utility I get, that is the commitment utility from having a vegetarian meal, is greater than the utility I get from a non-vegetarian meat. Okay, so let's say meat is red meat. Okay, as we know, in the West, after the health scares, red meat is considered unhealthy. But the temptation preference is that the V signifies temptation preference, that the satisfaction I get from meat is obviously much more than a vegetarian meat. That's fine. But the interesting thing which Gould-Pessendorfer introduced was this self-control cost or temptation cost. Okay, so which means if the agent is resisting temptation, she is incurring a self-control cost that is proportional to the maximum of fee. So the maximum value that fee can take, the choicest meat that you would have eaten, the steak or whatever you like. That. So that's what. So in some sense, if I refrain from a vegetarian non-meat meal with meat, then that's the self-control cost. So now the decision is going to depend on your self-control cost. So not just on the commitment preference, but also it depends on the self-control cost or the cost associated with controlling temptation. And you can see how that changes the decision problem immediately. Okay, so in my bribery example, so commitment preference would say B minus QF, which is what we have been taught, to handle, following Becker, Stickler, and all that. Okay, so we design Q and F so that that's equal to 0, and that's it. Our job is done. But supposing now you have the temptation preference, which kind of disregards all these sanctions and threat of sanctions and stuff like this. It simply looks at, what I'm going to do with this money which I get. How am I going to use? How am I going to buy a house, holiday in Switzerland, and stuff like this? So that's pure temptation preference. And that obviously is positive. And overall utility is going to depend on that. Okay? So I don't want to again explain that, but that's pretty much standard. Okay, so if I'm taking a bribe, then there is no temptation preference. Okay, so in that case, the two B's cancel. But supposing I decide not to take a bribe, then there is a temptation that I wish I had, okay, or I'm missing out on all that. So the first lesson is that it's not enough to make sanctions now. The traditional QF equals to B to deter bribery. We also now need to look at how we can raise you, that is how we can improve your temptation preference, okay, moral education and so on and so forth. There are people who talk about that. And lowering B, how we can reduce your temptation cost. Okay, so that's so in some sense these are new instruments which have been thrown. Okay, they're not kind of standard law enforcement instrument that we're used to, but they are part of the same problem. One way to solve that is through pre-commitment. Okay, so we can pre-commitment to eating a vegetarian by just going to a restaurant which has a restricted menu. So you just go to a vegetarian restaurant. Okay, so that you won't have this temptation that you missed out. So you're not going to see somebody eating butter chicken and then you feel bad. And so that's the first stage. So in the first stage, you decide the menu. Now, in some cases, it helps the planner by creating another regulatory tool, that is the menu choice, the first stage. But in some cases, it can lead to undesirable consequences also. So that is the way individuals or agents try to solve this by the first period coming. So I'm going to just quickly, 2 minutes each, consider two examples about how this first stage where we try to solve our temptation problem or the self-control cost problem, avoidance problem by pre-committing. So how that can lead to these two different situations. Okay? So there is no general rule of it. First one is the safety example. So this is again a new area. Temptation may cause consumers to buy cheap products that has a high or low safety standard. That often happens. We do tend to compromise. Why? Well, because you see, these are by definition temptation preferences, which are not going to look into, in a very scientific, objective way, the dangers. So we might end up buying unsafe products because we get carried away by the low price. Okay, but the safe products will satisfy the commitment preferences. So if I'm, ignoring my temptation, then I know that I should buy the safe product, which is a bit pricey. So how does it happen? Well, obviously that's going to affect the way the market operates and stuff like this. So one way is, yes, we can control the unsafe product by having as liability rules and sanctions in case you fall sick or something like this because of that. So product liability rules can, in some sense, affect offer solutions to this. But that happens in the second stage. Okay? So that is you have bought the product, the so-called unsafe product, but then something happens, and then you get some compensation, and the firm pays some. But what this commitment stage does is certain regulations can change the menu, and the simplest one is that supposing I place some minimum safety standard, which we know it happens. Okay? So what is that doing? Well, that's essentially changing the menu, this thing that consumers can buy at the first stage. So from a menu, I'm just giving you two menus. One is safe and high price, risky and low price. So that was the first menu. It reduces to safe and high price. So I've taken out the other thing from that menu. Okay, so in some sense, now if you buy the safe and high price, you're not getting the temptation cost or the self-control cost. Why? Because that option doesn't exist. So in some sense, I've kind of supplemented the traditional enforcement exposed and product safety standards by an ex ante. So that's one example where many choices can be beneficial. So these particular behavioral traits that people struggle, people always try to avoid these temptation costs or self-control costs. We can use it in our way. Is it always the case? And no. So my second example that it need not be beneficial. Yes, I'm using this example from Andrew Samberg. He's from Baltimore, so it's you can see the example by choosing. So this is about snitching. Okay, so in 2000 there was a gang-driven campaign in the US to ban these things by encouraging witnesses. So this was an interview with the rapper Cameron. Was asked if he would snitch. Snitch means whistleblow or go behind the back. If a serial killer was living next to him, so he replied, "I would probably move rather than inform the police." So you can see now here the temptation avoidance. Obviously, the commitment must be the preference who said that you should tell the police and stuff like this. So in order to avoid the temptation to snitch, he would choose to move. So in this case, clearly, the temptation avoidance is not in the interest of the society or the plan. So we need to incentivize snitching rather than encourage avoidance. Now, something similar, but it's different. So in a paper, we argue that in fact, a similar temptation avoidance leads to more red tape. Okay? So honest people who would like to avoid being in a situations where they will have to use their discretion and cope with bribery or the temptation of bribery would probably ex ante in the first stage, like you go to a vegetarian restaurant, they would try to create lots of red tape to tie their own hands or refuse to entertain any kind of discretionary decision making. So that's why we are choosing a menu with low discretion, and that in some cases, in some economic context, could be inefficiently very, very low. And so that's why. So you are solving one problem. You are encouraging corruption or bribe deterrence, or more and more people to abstain from bribery. But at the same time, you are probably encouraging more red tape. Okay? So in fact, the red tape is a little trickier because it's not just the control cost; it's also it's the reputation costs where in a society where there is a lot of corruption. So let's say in some cases our society where discretionary acts are likely to be viewed as corrupt acts. Okay, and so if you have done something which is discretionary, then people will suspect saying that, oh, you must have taken a bribe or something else. Okay, and so honest individuals with some efficient discretion. And so we end up with inefficient situations. In fact, somebody described our privatization program or why we have not been able to disinvest in a very aggressive or in a desirable way. We are always falling short of the disinvestment target. Let's hope it's not this way. It's because somebody described very beautifully. I don't know if I should take the name publicly, but I'm quoting him. That here it's the way we have been going about. It's like we have been driving and looking constantly at the rear view mirror. So you're always worried, that the price at which something has been auctioned off or sold. Later on, in case the price goes up or something like this, then you'll be accused saying that you must have taken a bribe to do that. Okay? So that's again, it's the negative side of this. So I'm going to conclude now. So we need to evaluate the implication of these legal interventions. I'm just giving you one. By going beyond the traditional rational actor. Probably have heard this several times yesterday. So it not only affects the deterrence level, because these behavioral considerations, our temptation, self-control, reputation costs, and everything. It has also implications on others. Okay. So, for example, the two examples I gave was, you can reduce bribery, but you're reducing red tape. You can reduce corruption, but you are increasing inefficiency. Now, these behavioral features can help the planner in some cases, so it's not always bad. Okay, it's not always complicating our enforcement problem, as I one example where we can use more tools. And in fact, as you can see now, there is a greater emphasis on behavioral economics coming into public policy. That is, we can use aspects of that to help make public policy more effective. But also at some same time, we should be aware that these behavioral features can be conflicting also with our basic aim. Okay, so deterrence becomes more difficult, or as I said, in some cases, we lose out efficiency. There is a growing literature. Okay? And you can, in fact, I started the literature, joined in pretty late. So you can join in by making literature and grow further. Okay, so that will be my wishes from you. Thank you. Again, 2 minutes within the time.
Thank you, sir, for the informative and enriching address. I will now be taking the questions from the Q&A section of the chat. Our first question is from Mr. Nayarakha Virisha, PhD Fellow, ISEC Bangalore. In fact, he has asked 2 questions. I will proceed with the first one. He asks how to disincentivize the corruption practices. Is his first question, sir.
Okay, well, I mean that's another lecture. So, I mean, I see. Okay, so let me say in this present concept, today's lecture was, disincentivize. We said that in the legal solution. So that's the only thing we talked. So which is a standard, that you put sanctions on bribery, you put, another layers of supervision and things like this. So that's one. But I feel that that's probably not always the best route. It hasn't been the most effective route. So I want to go the opposite route a little bit. So in some sense, you kind of incentivize honesty. Okay. So every department, every organization should kind of have systems to incentivize honesty. It need not be only rewards, like we had rewards for customs officials, and we have other kind of rewards also. In some countries, it's very aggressive. Brazil has very high rewards for customs officials. So that's one, but also beyond that, it's somebody who is honest. They should be named, they should be looked after, cared for, and stuff like this. So that's one way. Other one is, as we are now doing, using technology to reduce the scope. So that's nothing to do with incentivizing or disincentivizing, but you are simply limiting the scope of driving. Okay, but people cannot do this. And there will be others. So I don't know if I have answered your question, but I can take you to different literature. There's obviously huge literature on these issues, but that's broadly. So I think all I'm saying is that we probably need a shift in focus now. Okay, so we start with the premise of everybody is corrupt, everybody is distrustful, and so on and so forth. Now that I want to revisit and change it.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Virisha's second question is how to improve the effectiveness of legal instruments to achieve the desired outcomes, applying to the case of prevention of corruption.
Well, this should be no. Okay, let's find my personal this thing is avoid legal intervention in cases where you think it's going to affect the compliance very unfavorably. Okay, what does that mean? If the compliance costs are very high, okay, so that was my red tape example. So then we should not use legal intervention. We probably should use something else. Secondly, there should be, probably leave little scope for interpretation, the way the legal intervention should be used. So that will be more targeted, and then probably that will reduce the cost of the people who are going to comply. Okay, so those who are being detained. So these are the two key principles. Beyond that, there will be lots of small adjustments. I don't think I can answer in one go all those.
Thank you, sir. I will now invite Dr. Hitesh Kumar Thakkar to ask his questions.
Good afternoon, sir. Yeah, Hitesh Thakkar. If
Hi,
I
good
can
afternoon.
just recall, if I just summarize the session, then is it like in the actors and stakeholders which are behaving in the black economy? I think that phenomena you have captured in your model, and 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 in that I have only query with regard to temptation. I think whether temptation is a risk taker where people are in race of corruption. Yeah, people are in race of compromise, not monetary reward, but the other rewards, what they are interested, maybe power or other. So whether you are on discussing on that, and one other thing that sometimes things may be morally wrong, but legally and formally it is right. So how to differentiate then such thing like in that? But it was interesting presentation. Thank you, sir.
Very good. I mean, very good points. I think I should have. Let me begin with the second one, the moral and the legal. So as you say, something.
So you are not audible.
Let's begin with the second one. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay. So his point about something which is morally wrong, but legally it's fine, permissible. Okay, so in that case, how do you these things? You see, that's the reason why I'm raising these doubts about the legal interventions. Okay, why? Because there is a tendency. It's like the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation literature. If you remember there was the famous blood donation example that in UK, for example, blood donation was voluntary. So which is when there was enough supply of blood being donated. Okay, but then they introduced a price to it, so you'll get paid for whatever the small amount. So in that sense, suddenly there was a drop in it. Okay, so that prompted people to say that when it was being viewed as an altruistic act, people were volunteering to do it because they thought they are doing something good. But the moment you monetize it, they now start making cost benefit analysis. Okay, so is it worth going all the way, waiting for half an hour, sitting there and stuff? Is it worth £2? Okay, so that was the reason. So in some sense, the extrinsic motivations or incentives drove away the intrinsic ones. Now we have a similar concern here. So if something, we have a moral standard, so let's say we accept that something is morally not wrong, but by throwing in all these legal interventions, so what in some sense we are shifting the benchmark. Okay, so we are shifting the focus, and as Professor Basu would say, the laws they're like focal point. Okay, so now the legal intervention or what is permissible, what is not permissible, that's probably is becoming a focal point, and we're shifting away from the moral calculations. Okay, so we'll be mostly looking at now B minus FB or B minus QF, so that calculation. So that's in that sense. That's not ideal. So we should be very careful about these legal interventions when we think that that's going to drive away the moral these things. Okay. So in some sense, if they're complementary, if they supplement each other, then well and good. But not otherwise. So that's the second one. And the first one is I'm with you about the temptation. So it's not just bribery. It's also when you are exposed, when you are in that system, constantly being badgered, yes, the temptation to do certain things which you would not have done otherwise. Okay? So supposing, after a year, you think, oh, maybe that I should not have done, grant a little favor here or ignore something. So your subordinate officer is engaging in something, but you decide to ignore it in the interest of something. So those are the things, and they can build up. Okay. So that this literature that's why very, very, it's bringing it back to our discussion. But thank you, very good point.
Thank you, sir. I'll now be calling Professor Dr. Ranita Nagar to ask her questions.
Hi, Dr. Nagar.
Good afternoon, Professor Mishra, and thank you
Good
so much for
afternoon.
the amazing session and for your presence with us.
Yeah, I'm waiting for an invitation to come physically. Okay, I mean I love to see people.
No. Till the time we live in a was that online world, I will request you for some sessions in my classes, and if you permit, sir.
Definitely.
And in conference or any other platform, definitely, once this is let me also tell you, sir, in 2021 December, we are having a law and economics conference in Tamil Nadu National Law University under the aegis of this association we've established, Indian Association of Law and Economics.
Yeah.
It's already had 6 international conferences, and this is the 7th. So, I mean, I'm pre-intimating you for your, presence.
No, it's very impressive, and we should all thank you for all the efforts. Yeah.
Sir, once we meet, you will hear the entire story, the number of people involved, and very good people who have made this possible. Just it just so happens that I interacted with you. Otherwise, it's been a very joint collaboration of lots of people, and following footsteps shown by you and Professor Kaushik Basu and Professor Satish Jain and Professor Y.V. Reddy, and all of that. So, I mean, we accept all that background work, which made it possible for us to take some baby steps. Okay, so this was not supposed to be. I have. Remember, sir, I had called you when you were at Bath. Remember the previous conferences and all of that. And after that, I read a lot of your work on economics of bribe. It was very, very, very interesting and engrossing. So, 2 questions. The first, so you said that the index, rule of law index, is so very different, and you said that laws are not completely, laws are not the only factor. I know that would be many sessions for you to examine, but could you tell that in your scholarship, what would you say is the central difference, weightage? What would be? That's one question. And the second question is this, Professor, that given the interplay between moral standards and legal standards, are we not moving into a possibility that retrospectively the entire rule of law is changing the moral standards by and by, and that is a net social surplus erosion? Does it look like that?
Both are very difficult, very hard questions. So let me start with the rule of law. In fact, I'm now thinking of a project, with PhD students to look into that, because I tried to look up saying, because we normally use rule of law as a explanatory variable to explain something else. Okay. So these cross-country regressions will use rule of law on the right-hand side to explain growth rates or, stuff like this. But it has never been the case that why we find these variations. So one obvious answer, given that, Kaushik Basu talked about Republic of Beliefs yesterday, it could be that, these are different equilibria, okay? So different countries have kind of gone into different equilibria. So even if, let's say, the same legal system we have, of course, countries have different legal systems. And even if we control for enforcement, technology in terms of per capita income and things, so it's quite possible that different countries have got stuck in different equilibria. So some are, high trust, high compliance, low regulation equilibrium. So that's what one case, you could say all the Nordic countries, that could be, because you see, in some sense, so think of cases. So let's say in Norway, okay, Norway is number 2. So compliance is also a very, very high standard, except for maybe some very organized crime, it's generally crime-free. And so you don't tend to use the legal system so much, okay? So in some sense, whenever you are using, you get your justice also very quickly, okay? So to the citizens, the legal system is considered or perceived to be highly effective. So in that case, you also act in a similar way. But think of, the opposite saying, supposing we start up in a system where, the legal system is struggling to cope with it. Let's take India's case, let's say. So a lot of people will say that, oh, law is not, so a legal system is not effective. If you're poor, you don't get justice. If you're blah, 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 all those kind of things. So that kind of makes you, again, act in such a way which kind of justifies this belief. So that's why, so we could be caught into a different equilibria. How we move from one to another, now that's the big $1 million question. So that, I don't know. So that's one, a quick response to your first question, but that's very important. I think it's what the research project, what explains this. And the second one, the moral, I know that, see, it's so let's say go beyond bribery and things like this. So this is, I often use his book. He talks about the 3 B's, slavery, bribery, and usury. Okay. So, and the question being asked is, all these has moral connotation, okay? So right now, supposing even if we don't have a slavery, anti-slavery laws, we'll probably still will not allow slavery on moral grounds, okay? And similarly, usury, again, you may not have these things, but there will be social sanctions and moral compulsions about these things. So the question being asked is, whether we could have reached that moral standard without legal intervention early on. Okay, I don't know. I mean, I face the same problem in child labor when I teach. Okay, so child labor, is it because societies have become richer over time? So hence, they put more weight on child's education. So the returns or the opportunity cost of not sending a child to school becomes higher because we are a rich country now, so in that case, child labor vanishes, or it's because there were laws introduced to ban child labor. Now, which one is first? I don't know. I don't want to tell you a lie and say that I have one answer. But yes, that's something we'll always confront. So the easy way out will be that we're not going to choose one between another. But as I said, in many cases they will supplement each other. It's just that we should not, kind of confine ourselves to one region, saying that, oh, it has to be only this, and not, be happy that, let's bring in the law banning child labor, and then, we forget about it, that everything will be fine after that. So that is not going to happen. So that's a safe stand, and that's, I think, a productive way of looking at it.
Thank you, Professor. I will engage with you on this through mails and all, because your answer gives me so many further questions. So
that's right, yeah, because these are proper research projects. I think.
Thank you, sir. Seeing that there are no other questions, I'll again like to invite Ranita ma'am to propose the vote of thanks for this plenary session.
So I thought I had already done that in the interlude,
That's right. Yeah.
So Professor Ajit Mishra, thank you so much for being with us. We've been so I don't know. I think Dr. Hitesh, this conference has been all conferences have been very, very, very good, but this has been just out of the way. I'm sure Dr. Thakkar will agree, because we've tried to bring you at other conferences, and maybe it was that offline world, because I remember very clearly, and you had also
forget me,
at a point of time you were moving to US, and then you were moving back, and so this is worked out so well. Our loss, that is taken time, but our gain, that finally we made it happen, because your work is very, very important in these areas of behavioral economics, and specifically in the area of bribe, and I'm sure others also which maybe have not followed up. We would really want to engage with you at multiple levels with your institute. If there are projects that we could work on together, learn from you. We have amazing students, brilliant students, Professor. If with a bit of training, of course, with a bit of training, they can contribute very, very significantly. On that note, I just thank you and hope to look ahead to further academic collaboration. So, thank you.
Thank
Can
you.
I take 10 seconds, madam? Is it, I'm audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
I want to apologize, Mr. Sir, because I sent mails and he has requested me to take out his name because we have prepared one that group mail ID, and I
Yeah.
bother him a lot. Sorry for that, sir. But
No. I must
but
have
there is
said
no other.
So that must have been some time back, Hitesh, not recently. Because yeah, I mean.
But I could not take out, sir,
so
because there
many
are
emails.
multiple groups are there. So yeah. So due to technical reason, I'm not taking out that. We want you to be there, so that's why I'm
Okay.
accepting that.
Fine. I won't complain in future. Okay. I won't complain in future.
This was something
Thank you,
that you spoke of today, Professor. And let me also apologize, since it is, we are into the moral world. Sir, I did not inform you maybe sufficiently that it came in my head, but I did not communicate because I was caught up in so many things, that Kaushik Basu sir is talking about, the area that you had suggested. So
Yeah,
I mean,
but it's
it
not.
must have been.
Don't need to apologize. Because I was talking to Kaushik last week. He also didn't mention that. He's talking.
No.
So, but
I was supposed to. I mean, that was not his. That was not on his platter. That was on the platter of the organizer. So, yes, I should have. So I apologize.
it's very good. It's wonderful, and then I think in future you should do blended. It's impossible to get people like Oliver Hart and Kaushik, at a time when you want them to come. It's not so easy. So you could have some of these plenary talks online and continue the physical. That's what at least we at IG are planning.
We will,
Okay,
sir. We will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. With that, we conclude our plenary session. The technical session 5 will resume at 2 p.m. We have a break from 1 to 2. Thank you.